January 1945. Eastern France. The snow along the Moselle River is packed hard by tank treads and boot soles, stained dark by fuel and blood. Engines idle in the cold, growling low, impatient. American armor sits nose to nose with the enemy, separated by frozen fields and shattered villages that no longer have names, only grid coordinates. Inside the U.S. Third Army Command Area, order exists on paper. Maps are clean. Arrows are sharp. Timetables are precise. And at the top of it all stands General George S. Patton, iron discipline, polished boots, a voice that tolerates no hesitation. But beyond the map table, something is slipping. Reports arrive late, units advance without clearance. Prisoners are taken roughly or not taken at all. German resistance collapses faster than expected in some sectors while others descend into chaos. The results are undeniable. So are the complaints. Patton reads the messages in silence. He recognizes the handwriting. He knows the name. This is not incompetence. This is not cowardice. Not cowardice. This is a commander who fights like a gangster. Fast, ruthless, uncontrollable. And for the first time in the war, even Patton cannot bring him fully to heel. The U.S. Army did not plan for men like this, but the war created them anyway, too. By the time American forces crossed into Europe in strength, the United States Army was still discovering what kind of institution it had become. In 1939, it was small, cautious, professionally conservative. Its senior officers had been shaped by world wars, by static lines, attrition, and rigid chains of command. Promotions were slow. Doctrine was orderly. Aggression was discussed, but rarely practiced at scale. War, as the U.S. Army understood it, was something to be managed, not unleashed. Not unleashed. Then Europe collapsed. Poland fell in weeks, France in days. German armored columns did not wait for permission or perfect alignment. They moved fast, cut deep, and accepted chaos as a weapon. Radios replaced runners. Initiative replaced hierarchy. Officers who hesitated were bypassed or broken. American observers took notes. They watched German panzer commanders disobey standing orders to exploit breakthroughs. They saw junior officers make decisions that would have required headquarters approval in any other army. The lesson was uncomfortable but clear. Modern war punished caution. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, it did so with industry and manpower, but without combat-tested leadership. The Army expanded at a speed no institution could fully control. New divisions formed. New corps emerged. Men who had commanded battalions suddenly led divisions. Colonels became generals almost overnight. The system did not have time to refine personalities. It could only measure results. Into this environment stepped George S. Patton. Patton was not an invention of the war. He was its perfect fit. Aggressive to the point of obsession, he believed motion itself was a moral force. To Patton, speed saved lives. Hesitation killed them. He demanded relentless advance, rigid discipline, and absolute obedience, especially to his intent. Yet even Patton understood something the rule books did not say out loud. To win fast wars, you sometimes needed dangerous men. In North Africa in 1942, the U.S. Army learned this lesson the hard way. Early engagements against German forces exposed American weaknesses. Slow reactions, poor coordination, commanders unwilling to act without orders. The shock was severe. Defeat forced adaptation. Patton's answer was not subtle. He imposed iron discipline on appearance, movement, and command. Sapper. Helmets were worn. Salutes enforced. Timelines mattered. But beneath that surface order, he quietly rewarded aggression. Officers who took ground without permission, but held it, were rarely punished. Those who waited for instructions while opportunities passed were removed. Results became the currency of survival. By 1943, as American forces moved into Sicily, this unwritten rule was widely understood. Commanders who delivered victories were protected, even when their methods raised eyebrows. Headquarters filed complaints. Military police submitted reports. Civil affairs officers protested behavior that threatened long-term stability. But the war kept moving, and as long as the front advanced, discipline remained negotiable. This was not corruption. It was triage. Patton himself embodied the contradiction. Publicly, he demanded strict control. And privately, he tolerated men who bent rules if they broke the enemy. He believed command was not about temperance, it was about momentum. If a subordinate could move faster than the enemy could react, Patton would shield him from scrutiny. At least, At first, the U.S. Army, still young in global war, lacked a clear boundary between necessary ruthlessness and dangerous excess. There were regulations, of course, field manuals, articles of war, codes of conduct. But none of them answered the real question facing commanders in 1944 and 1945. How much disorder could be accepted in the pursuit of victory? The answer would not come from doctrine. It would come from one man who pushed the limit further than anyone expected. And by the time the Army realized what it had tolerated, it was already too late to pretend he was an exception. The general who would earn the whispered label a gangster did not arrive suddenly on Patton's staff or at the head of a famous army. He emerged the way many wartime commanders did, through attrition, urgency, and opportunity. Before the war, he was not a celebrity. His record was solid, not brilliant. West Point had taught him procedure. The interwar army had taught him patience. But neither environment had prepared him for the velocity of modern combat. When war came, it stripped away the habits that had kept him restrained. His early assignments placed him close to the fighting, close enough to see how quickly advantage evaporated when officers hesitated. Close enough to understand that regulations meant little once artillery began to fall and radios went silent. He learned fast, faster than many of his peers. By 1943, his units were moving differently. They exploited gaps that had not yet been reported to headquarters. When resistance appeared, he did not always wait for approval to bypass it or to crush it. The results were immediate. Ground gained. Enemy units shattered before they could reorganize. Timetables beaten, sometimes by days. His after-action reports were thin on detail, but rich in outcomes. And outcomes were what the Army needed. Superiors noticed, not because he was charismatic or politically connected, but because his name appeared repeatedly beside arrows that moved farther and faster than expected. He did not fight cleanly. He fought decisively. Patton encountered him through results first, not personality. In briefings, his sectors showed progress while others stalled. When Patton asked how objectives had been taken so quickly, the explanations were often vague. Initiative, opportunity. Initiative, opportunity. Pressure. Patton did not press for more. At the time, he admired it. The nickname came later, quietly behind closed doors. It was not a term of admiration, nor entirely of condemnation. It described a style. A man who operated by instinct rather than regulation, who valued fear as much as morale, queer as much as morale, who treated the battlefield not as a system, but as territory to be dominated. Some officers avoided him. Others followed him with near total loyalty. They knew he would protect them if they advanced, and abandon them if they hesitated. His command climate was tense, efficient, and unforgiving. Discipline existed, but it was selective. Appearance mattered less than performance. Orders were interpreted aggressively. If something could be done faster, it was. If rules interfered, they were bent. Complaints began to accumulate. Military police reports noted rough handling of prisoners. Civil affairs officers warned that liberated towns were being treated like hostile ground. Liaison officers described operations launched without coordination, creating confusion for adjacent units. None of these reports stopped him. The war was accelerating. In 1944, after Normandy, the Western Front became a race against German reorganization, against supply limitations, against winter, winter. Patton's Third Army surged eastward, and commanders who could keep pace were rare. This general could. Patton promoted speed above all else. He wanted commanders who could think ahead of the enemy and act before headquarters caught up. For a time, the gangster general seemed like the embodiment of Patton's philosophy, action without paralysis. But the alignment was never perfect. Patton believed in control, even when moving fast. He expected loyalty upward as much as aggression forward. The gangster general respected outcomes more than hierarchy. He took Patton's intent seriously, but not always his authority. That difference was subtle at first. Then it began to widen. By late 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany itself, the consequences of unchecked aggression grew harder to ignore. The enemy was no longer retreating in open country. The terrain was dense. Civilians were everywhere. Political considerations pressed down on tactical decisions. Speed alone was no longer enough, and the same traits that had once delivered victories now threatened something the U.S. Army could not afford to lose: control. From this point, the story can no longer be told from a single direction. It must be examined from every angle at once. Front or angle at once. Human angle, those who served under the gangster general rarely described him as unpredictable. He was, in fact, brutally consistent. He slept little. He moved constantly. He appeared without warning at forward positions, sometimes before units realized they were engaged. His presence was not theatrical like Patton's. There were no speeches, no ritual, just pressure. Questions came fast. Answers were expected faster. He rewarded initiative immediately. A platoon leader who advanced without orders and seized a bridge might find himself promoted within weeks. An officer who delayed, even for sound reasons, could be relieved on the spot. There were no appeals, no explanations. Loyalty flowed downward, not upward. Fear was not a byproduct of his command. It was a tool, yet many followed him willingly. He shielded his subordinates from higher headquarters as long as they delivered results. He ignored paperwork. He dismissed procedural errors as peacetime concerns. In combat, he was visible, relentless, and decisive. For soldiers under fire, that mattered. But the cost was cumulative. Exhaustion set in. Margins for error vanished. Units became brittle, effective, but fragile. One mistake could undo weeks of momentum. Tactical angle on the battlefield. His methods produced asymmetric results. He favored penetration over consolidation. Instead of securing flanks, he drove forward, trusting speed to protect exposed sides. Enemy units were bypassed rather than destroyed, left to collapse behind advancing columns. It was risky, sometimes dangerously so. But it worked. Until it didn't. German forces, already strained, struggled to respond to such tempo. Command and control broke down. Rear units were overrun by formations that appeared where intelligence said none existed. Entire defensive plans unraveled because one sector moved faster than expected. Yet this style created logistical chaos. Supply lines stretched thin. Adjacent units found themselves misaligned. When resistance stiffened, there was often no reserve to absorb the shock. Higher headquarters tolerated this because gains were real. Maps showed progress. Casualties at first were acceptable. Patton understood the tactic. He had used it himself, but Patton also understood its limits. Leadership in the U.S. Army was supposed to be replicable. Systems mattered. Commanders were expected to produce results that others could follow and sustain. The gangster general produced results that could not be copied. His success depended entirely on his presence, his pressure, his willingness to push beyond constraints. Remove him, and the system faltered. Subordinates were conditioned to act only at extremes, either total aggression or total paralysis. Patton noticed this. In briefings, the general spoke less about coordination and more about movement. He treated orders as suggestions. When questioned, he cited outcomes. When warned, he nodded and continued as before. This was not insubordination in the classic sense. It was something more subtle. A commander operating at the edge of acceptable autonomy, daring the system to stop him. For months, it didn't, because the enemy kept retreating. Because victory kept coming. But pressure does not disappear. It accumulates, and as the front tightened and winter deepened, every angle of this story began to intersect. The human strain, the tactical risk, the leadership imbalance. All of it moving toward a moment when speed alone would no longer protect him. Enemy angle to the German forces facing him, the gangster general was not known by name. He was known by pattern. Reports from Wehrmacht units described sudden penetrations with little warning. American columns appeared on roads believed to be secure. Rear area units were engaged by armor that should not have been there yet. The front, already unstable, began to feel porous. German officers struggled to understand how these advances were happening so quickly. Reconnaissance reports lagged behind reality. Defensive lines were planned against an enemy that no longer waited to be located. Yet the same German reports noted something else. The advances were reckless. Flanks were exposed. Supply convoys were vulnerable. Units advanced beyond artillery coverage. When German resistance hardened, when prepared positions or counterattacks appeared, the American formations sometimes stalled abruptly, lacking coordination or support. German commanders began to adapt. They did not try to stop him everywhere. They waited for the moment when momentum outpaced control. Then they struck where the structure was weakest. Institutional angle inside the U.S. Army, concern was growing. The army was no longer fighting alone. Allied coordination mattered. Civilian populations mattered. Political oversight mattered. The margin for unilateral action was shrinking. Reports involving the gangster general reached higher echelons with increasing frequency. Some were tactical complaints, units advancing without coordination. Others were administrative failure to report prisoners properly, disregard for civil military protocols, friction with allied units. Individually, each incident was explainable. Collectively, they formed a pattern. Patton was asked, quietly, about his subordinate. His responses were measured. He acknowledged the issues. He emphasized the results. He promised attention, but Patton was also under pressure. His army's success was visible. Slowing it down carried its own risk. Removing an aggressive commander in the middle of operations could disrupt momentum. For a time, Patton chose containment over confrontation. Moral angle war does not suspend morality. It compresses it. The gangster general's approach left little room for restraint. Prisoners were processed quickly, sometimes roughly. Civilians were treated as potential obstacles rather than assets. Orders emphasized speed and dominance, not nuance. Most of this remained within the blurred boundaries of frontline combat, but the line between aggression and excess grew thinner as the fighting moved into populated areas and as the enemy's collapse accelerated. Officers beneath him began to ask questions, not openly, but among themselves. How far was too far? At what point did effectiveness become liability? The Army's answer was never abstract. It arrived only when something broke. By early 1945, the Western Front was no longer fluid in the same way. Resistance stiffened, weather slowed movement, supply shortages tightened constraints. The gangster general's style, once an asset, began to magnify every friction point. Patton could feel it. The reports no longer described clean breakthroughs. They described confusion, overextension, close calls that bordered on disaster. The same traits that had once delivered speed now threatened cohesion. All angles, enemy adaptation, institutional pressure, moral cost, were converging. And they were doing so at the worst possible moment, because the war was nearing its end. And in the final phase of a war, control matters more than audacity. What happened next would test not just the gangster general, but Patton himself. February 1945. The Ardennes had frozen under a bitter winter, but the fighting had shifted east, along the Moselle, and into the Siegfried Line. American forces were pressing toward the Rhine, and every hour counted. Patton's Third Army moved with brutal precision, supposedly. But one sector told a different story. The gangster general's division had advanced more than 40 kilometers in 72 hours. Tanks had reached villages unscouted. Infantry had taken bridges without artillery preparation. Supply convoys struggled to keep pace, spilling fuel and ammunition along narrow roads. Reports of disorganized traffic and stranded vehicles piled on Patton's desk. Intelligence officers described gaps in the flanks so wide that a single counterattack could have split the column in two. Yet the general's men were victorious. Bridges held, enemy units disintegrated before they could regroup. German reports described ghost formations appearing out of nowhere, collapsing resistance. Patton knew the risks. He called for updates. He asked his staff to ensure coordination. Yet every time the orders reached the gangster general, they were executed in a modified form. Timelines accelerated, obstacles bypassed, deviations justified by outcomes. The first serious collision came on February 18. A lightly defended village, vital to the supply route, was overrun. American units had seized it without waiting for engineering teams to clear mines. An entire convoy of trucks was lost when a hidden German artillery position opened fire. Patton received the reports in the evening, along with complaints from his corps commanders. They demanded restraint. They demanded adherence to procedure, but the general's explanation was succinct. The objective was ours, sir. The enemy collapsed. Delay would have cost us momentum. Patton understood reluctantly. But the tension was palpable. This was no longer a tactical quirk. Momentum alone was failing to mask recklessness. The general had pushed beyond what even a commander like Patton could immediately control. Even Patton's iron discipline had limits, and now they were being tested. Every staff officer, every subordinate, every adjacent commander began to feel the pressure. Coordination frayed, supply routes jammed. Casualties, previously acceptable, crept upward. Intelligence gaps widened. The war's speed had created a problem that rules alone could not fix. And on February 19, everything changed. February 1945. The Gangster General's division reached the outskirts of a small town along the Moselle. Patton's staff had requested a pause to consolidate positions, secure flanks, and coordinate with artillery and adjacent units. The general ignored it. He sent forward reconnaissance teams. Tanks pushed into the streets without infantry support. The Gangster General embodied this contradiction. He was both a force multiplier and a liability, a human embodiment of the tension between initiative and discipline in high-speed war. Strategically, the operation accelerated the Allied advance. German forces were pushed closer to the Rhine, forcing retreats and collapsing defensive lines in neighboring sectors. The achievement validated Patton's philosophy of aggressive maneuver, but it also highlighted the fragile limits of control when one man operated above the system. Hurry! The stage was set for larger reckoning. The consequences of unchecked aggression could no longer be contained to reports and complaints. Institutional authority had to reassert itself before the final phase of the campaign. In the weeks following the Moselle operation, the Gangster General remained in command, but under close scrutiny. Patton, aware of both the operational gains and the growing risks, imposed tighter reporting requirements. Liaison officers were stationed directly with his units. Movements were logged in detail. Deviations had to be justified, not simply executed. The general adapted, partially. Momentum was still maintained, but some initiatives were tempered by oversight. Staff officers noticed a subtle shift. He began anticipating the restrictions, planning moves within the lines while still exploiting opportunities. The tension between autonomy and control became a constant negotiation. The Army's institutional response extended beyond Patton. Higher command reviewed the reports and documented lessons for future operations. The situation highlighted a recurring challenge: how to integrate aggressive, results-driven leaders into a hierarchical military structure. Manuals could prescribe tactics and procedures, but leadership temperament could not be standardized. Post-war evaluations later reflected on this period. Memoirs and official histories acknowledged the Gangster General's brilliance, tempered by the chaos he generated. Patton himself referenced him sparingly, admiration mixed with caution. In correspondence, he noted that some men could deliver extraordinary victories, but only if their impulses were channeled carefully. For historians, the episode illustrates the duality of total war, AL Ender. The United States Army needed speed, aggression, and initiative to succeed. Yet the same traits that produced triumph also threatened the very system enabling it. Units were stretched, logistics strained, and control tested, all under the pressure of a fast-moving campaign. Even within the victorious Third Army, the Gangster General's legacy was ambiguous. Soldiers spoke of his daring and fearlessness. Superiors recalled moments of near disaster. Allies and civilians remembered both liberation and turmoil. The episode left a quiet, enduring lesson. In war, extraordinary talent can be both a gift and a burden. The Gangster General had won battles, disrupted the enemy, and sped the advance. But he had also reminded the Army that even the most brilliant commanders must answer to limits. The story could not conclude with reports and results alone. It demanded reflection on leadership, war, and human ambition. War has a way of revealing extremes in character. The Gangster General, with his unrelenting drive and disregard for convention, embodies both the promise and peril of unchecked initiative. He achieved victories others deemed impossible, yet he also exposed the fragility of structure and discipline in even the most advanced military. Patton, the epitome of controlled aggression, recognized that brilliance alone could not replace order. Speed, audacity, and courage were essential, but only within the framework that preserved cohesion and accountability. The Gangster General challenged that balance, testing the boundaries of what one man could do without toppling the system around him. In a broader sense, his story illustrates a timeless tension in warfare between human impulse and institutional necessity, between individual genius and collective stability. Modern combat rewards boldness, yet punishes excess. It demands leaders who can act decisively, but also recognize that victory is fragile when authority is eroded. History remembers him ambiguously. Soldiers admired him, Enemies feared him, and commanders respected him, but always with caution. The lessons endure. In the chaos of battle, talent can shape outcomes, but it can also strain the very forces it seeks to lead. Even the most brilliant general must answer to the invisible boundaries of responsibility, consequence, and control. The gangster general's legacy is not only the ground he gained or the enemy he shattered, it is the reminder that war, at its heart, is as much about tempering human instinct as it is about defeating the adversary. In that truth lies the paradox of command. Even men who fight like gangsters must, eventually, confront the limits imposed by history, duty, and the armies they serve.